Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Joining us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and we're going to take a look at how age at calf pairing can impact health, behavior, and performance. So, Dr. Kertz, before we get started, we want to invite our guests to post any questions they might have there in the chat area on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, post those there in your social channels. Welcome, Dr. Kertz. Great to have you back with us here today.
Well, it's good to be here. Better to be inside and outside with our hot, muggy weather. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, right? It has been super warm and super
Mhm.
humid. I know probably down your way it's even more humid than up this
Right.
way. They always blame the corn. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but they say the corn perspires or gives off
Uh,
whatever it does, and that's causing humidity. Who knows? But we're going to talk dairy cattle here today, and I know you've got some slides and some research to talk about. So go ahead and let's get started.
well, some of you will recall that over the last 10 years or so, well, actually further back than that, there's been quite a bit of work done with dairy calf welfare, and that's good because it kind of pairs with the nutrition side. Although sometimes I've been a little critical because they don't sometimes pay attention to the starter, and that can actually predetermine some of the responses you get from a feeding behavior and that sort of thing. But one of the areas that has evolved out of that is the benefits or potential benefits of pairing calves in housing, like in hutches, instead of just one having two. There's been initial thought that that was not a good idea because if one calf has a disease problem, then the other calf can get it. And so that's been a reason to keep the isolation. But more recently, they have said, well, let's take a look and see what the actual results are. And let's see what happens with health and their behavior and their performance. And so that was done on a large commercial dairy farm in Brazil. And it was done in their period of August to December of 2023, which means that that's really early spring into early summer there because they're south of the equator. And they hypothesized that calves paired early will show higher initial calf starter intake and do better in terms of growth and performance and behavior if they were paired earlier rather than later. And so what they did was they had a total of 140 Holstein female calves. And so that was 70 pairs. And then they included those in his study. Now, the interesting thing is that may sound like quite a few animals, 48 per treatment of three different pairings, but they actually did a little statistical analysis and said that that would only provide the power to detect differences in disease prevalence if they're greater than 30%. So that means that if you had 30% in your control and you wanted to pick up a difference, it would have to be 60% in the treatment. So that was a potential limitation, was the number of calves. And what they did was after the calves were born, they were fed colostrum and so on. And you can find the details in the report. I copied quite a bit of that verbatim because there's quite a bit of protocol they did. It's pretty exhausted, especially to do that on a commercial dairy farm, because then you usually have to deal with the labor and the practices and the local facilities and that sort of thing. So they started out with pasteurized waste milk, and then they blended that with milk replacer, and that information is provided. And they tried to reach about 14% solids, which is a good level of solids. With if you get above 15% or so, I think that's where I call it the red flag area. You're more likely to have digestive upsets. So everything looked like it was pretty well done. Now, interestingly, the calf starter was 24% protein and about 15% NDF, but it was also mixed with a commercial with corn silage. And when corn silage, it was fed with it, corn silage was dumped on top of it, and about a third of that was corn silage. So there's a difference in when they began this feeding. At day 31, they began the corn silage feeding. So the three different treatments were, they began at, let's see, I think it's 7 days. Yeah, go to the second page. 6 to 7 days was the initial pairing, and then you had an intermediate group that paired at 29 to 30 days, and then a late pairing group at 49 to 50 days. Now they continued to feed these calves at a step up and a step down process with the pasteurized waste milk replacer mix, and so they weren't fully weaned until they were about, let's see, 74 days of age. And so that's much later than normal we see in the US. But the way they did the studies made sense for them to do it that way. So the question then was, is there going to be any benefit from pairing them at this early stage, 6 to 7 days, versus the middle and the later stages? And then, of course, they had on-the-farm protocols. The veterinarian did regular scoring of fecal and health. They look for bovine respiratory disease, BRD. They look at scouring, and then they had treatments for that. So they tried to keep things as consistent as they could and recorded. And there was no way to keep the farm workers, though, from knowing what the different pairings were, because it was obvious. So there was no blind treatment effects from the calves, so from the workers. So then another area that they did was behavior. And there's, again, a fairly significant amount of behavior observations 5 times a week after the morning feeding at 8 o'clock, and after the afternoon feeding at 4 o'clock. They did observations, and those are outlined, and they were taken every 5 minutes for a total of 30 minutes. And so they had 7 different scans per session. So there was a lot of observations being made there. And then they also looked at their reaction to the feed, the TMR, the first time they saw the TMR. What was their response? So if we talk a little bit about some of the results, we can look at the first table. And before I cover that, there were similar pairings of calves between first calf heifers and older cows, so no bias there. Their birth weight was only about 78, 79 pounds, which for Holsteins is quite small. That might be characteristic of that herd, though, in that particular area. And then when they put them into their treatments, they had to make sure they were similar in body weight. They looked at calving difficulty. They didn't really see any differences among the pairing ages, and did not find any difference even among the first calf and the older cows. Mortality rate was very low in this study, only 1.4%. And so just 2 calves died. That's very good. The average number of health treatments until weaning per calf and pairing did not differ either by treatments. So when you look at those observations, this was an extremely healthy herd and set of calves. Now, if we look at the data in that table 1, we see that the daily gains were fairly consistent across the board. So if you look at 0 to 30 days by the early, intermediate, and late pairing, they're almost identical. 2.2, which is about a kilogram, and the p-value is 0.98. So when you get to the couple down below, you see the p-values go down to 0.04, 0.06. And so the earlier pairing seemed to be doing a little bit better in daily gains. But what really struck me when I first looked at these daily gains was they're really high, because for young calves, we would expect it to be more like 1.5 to maybe 1.75 pounds or so. But that's not what the case was here. It was all that much higher. But I think the reason they're that high is because, remember, the starter TMR mix was about a third corn silage. So I think they had quite a bit of gut fill, and then distorts the body weight, but it of course calculates in as a higher rate of gain. So then the other area that they wanted to look at was animal behavior. So if we look at the first figures, and those are provided by Dr. Ruan Daros, one of the authors of the study, we see that if you look at the upper one, estimated mean of idle behavior, the idle behavior across the three groups of calves, because they started them in groups, was very low for the youngest age. That was about that 7-day age. The other two treatments were middle and then later pairing. You see there's the first group was about the same, and the third group was about the same, but the second group, there was some difference there, a little bit there. And then if you look at the estimated mean of exploratory behavior per calf, that's when they first were exposed to the TMR, which had the corn silage in it. You see that the calves that were paired at early age in each of the three groups, they were the ones that had the most exploratory behavior. They were the ones that wanted to find out what was this feed mix that we're now getting in front of us, as opposed to the other two pairings. They were much lower and not as involved in that behavior. So then let's look at the next behavior set. Here, looking at percentage of calves that had contact with the new TMR at 50 days of age. And you see that there's, at the upper part, the percentage that had some contact was a bit higher, statistically higher for the early age, and then lower for the mid and later pairing ages. And if you look at the latency, that is, how long did it take them, you see that the early pairing calves, they had the first and quickest exposure or of the TMR than the older calves. So it's an indication that the earlier pairing affected their behavior, and that's been seen in some other studies as well. Now, the other aspect, the major aspect, was what about health? Well, remember, there were only 1.2% death loss in these calves. So that's extremely good. So the level of BRD and diarrhea was low. And so they really didn't pick up any difference. In other words, the early age of pairing calves did not have any negative effects on health than the older ones. And some of the thinking might be that the younger age, if anything, they would be the most susceptible to health issues. But in this particular study, that wasn't the case, because there was very little health problems throughout the study and almost no mortality. So what the finding was in this study was that you can pair the calves at a very young age, and if anything, they do a little better based on what we saw a little bit on the daily gains, and no more negative effects on health. And they seem to have a little bit more engaging effect on exploring their new environment, like when the GMR was at first provided to them. So that's the extent of this study. I have to compliment the authors, because with a large commercial herd, to pull out 3 groups of calves in different segments of about 48 per treatment, that's a lot of work. So not only was it work for the farm people, but it was work for the people who are collecting the data and the information. So this is the first study of this type that I've seen where they've really looked at this pairing effect at different ages, and they found no difference.
So then is there the bottom line? What do you want to leave our audience with here today, Dr. Kertz?
Well, I think it says we can begin pairing calves at a young age, and we know there's some benefit. We saw a little bit of a benefit here. Now, the question still remains, if there are significant disease issues on a dairy farm, bovine viral disease or diarrhea, will the early pairing calves then do as well? We don't know that. But, one of the problems when you try to do studies with calves related to health is you have no idea what their health is going to be. It could be really good up to that point, and then you can have a set of calves that go through a period when they don't do as well, and you can't figure out why they don't do as well, maybe not even related to health. So there's always those variables. But this says that, yeah, it can be done, and was done on a commercial herd that had large sets of calves. And so the practical point is, if you compare them, then the other thinking is that these calves may do better as heifers when they're grouped, and then later as cows when they're grouped, because they're used to some group interaction as paired calves at an early age. Now, the one limitation of this study is that they finished it at 74 days. So there were no observations after that. I would have liked to have seen a couple of weeks after that, because in all likelihood, they then put those calves into smaller groups and see how they did by different ages of pairing. But I can understand why that's almost impossible to do at a commercial dairy farm. So that's why it wasn't done.
Right. Yeah, exactly. We kind of follow them a little farther out might have been useful. So
yeah, and they can still follow them out, but they just won't have them grouped in certain categories.
Gotcha. Okay. Very good. All right. Well, thank you so much for your insight today, Dr. Kertz. If you want to see more about this article, you can certainly look at the digital edition of Feedstuffs, which is coming to your inbox this week. So until next time, Dr. Kertz, thank you.
You're welcome.
We appreciate all of you for joining us as well. A reminder, all Feedstuffs 365 sessions are available in on-demand format. Until next time for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.